Hello everyone. So I wanted to make an extra video on this particular topic regarding the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary and how together they form kind of this master control center for the regulation of a lot of different hormones that the body produces. This is a particularly complex and can be a confusing subject, so I wanted to make sure I made an extra video to provide a little bit of extra clarification here. So what I have drawn here is I've got basically all the different axes kind of drawn in one picture here. So the general idea is that the hypothalamus up here is going to release one of 6 potential hormones. So these hormones come in 2 varieties. We have releasing hormones and we have inhibiting hormones. And these hormones are the way that the hypothalamus communicates with the next gland in the chain, which is the anterior pituitary. So our releasing hormones are going to be 4 of them. So we have GnRH, which is gonadotropin releasing hormone. We have CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. We have TRH, which is thyrotropin releasing hormone, and then we've got GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone. So these 4 releasing hormones, when the hypothalamus secretes them, are going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to release, hence the name, its hormones that go with those releasing hormones. And then our inhibiting hormones are dopamine, which is also called prolactin inhibiting hormone, and then we've got somatostatin, which is sometimes also called growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Okay, so depending on which one of these releasing and inhibiting hormones is released by the hypothalamus, that's going to dictate what the anterior pituitary does. So if the hypothalamus releases GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, the anterior pituitary is going to choose to release follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So this is the one case of the anterior pituitary releasing 2 hormones in response to one coming from the hypothalamus. In every other case, it's a 1-to-1 deal, meaning the hypothalamus releases 1 hormone, the anterior pituitary releases 1 as well. So if we choose to release GnRH from the hypothalamus, that will lead the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH, and the target here is going to be the gonads, meaning the testes if you are a male and the ovaries if you are a female. And the resulting hormone will be testosterone or estrogen, depending on your gender, right? So that's one potential way that we could do this. That's if the hypothalamus releases GnRH. What if instead of that, the hypothalamus releases CRH? So that is going to precipitate a completely different chain of events. So if it's CRH, that will stimulate the anterior pituitary to instead make a hormone called ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. The target here for ACTH is not going to be the gonads, but is rather going to be the adrenal cortex. And the adrenal cortex will then be stimulated to make cortisol. So that's another way that we can do it. GnRH if you want to stimulate your sex hormone production, CRH if you want to stimulate cortisol. So there is a clear, defined pathway that each one of these will take. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. How about this time the hypothalamus is going to release TRH? Well, that will stimulate the anterior pituitary to instead make a hormone called TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. And given the name, that tells us that the next target in the chain is going to be the thyroid, of course, right? And the thyroid will be stimulated to make its 2 hormones called T3 and T4 are 2 thyroid hormones. Okay, that's another pathway that we can take here. How about growth hormone releasing hormone? If that is the case, then we are going to end up with the production of, I put that in the wrong place here, I apologize. So growth hormone releasing hormone onto the anterior pituitary is going to stimulate the production of growth hormone, hence the name. So growth hormone is going to be a little bit of a different case as what we've seen before. All of these hormones coming from the anterior pituitary have very specific targets. Growth hormone has many, many targets all over the body, so we are going to say many tissues here. The reason being, growth hormone is going to have a lot of anabolic stimulating effects, meaning we are stimulating growth and development and glucose-sparing effects all over the body. So it's not going to be one specific cell or tissue that responds to growth hormone. It's going to be many, many of them. And then finally, you'll notice here that we're kind of out of releasing hormones. So this is going to have to do with the last of the anterior pituitary hormones, which is called prolactin, which is sometimes shortened as PRL. So prolactin is actually not stimulated by one of these releasing or inhibiting hormones, but it is stimulated by a hormone that is made by the hypothalamus. In this case, we are talking about oxytocin. So oxytocin will stimulate prolactin production from the anterior pituitary, and then dopamine is going to inhibit it. So whether you are lactating or not will depend on the balance of those hormones. In all likelihood, you will be inhibited rather than stimulated. So prolactin, as you can imagine, is going to stimulate the mammary glands. A little misspelling there, but that's okay. So this pretty much covers the whole hypothalamus anterior pituitary axis in terms of which hypothalamus hormones will get the anterior pituitary to secrete which of its 6 hormones. So what this does not quite cover is how negative feedback works. So let's talk a little bit about that now. So in this particular diagram, we are assuming that we are going to stimulate the adrenal cortex. So this type of negative feedback pretty much works for any of the hormones that we could have picked in the previous picture, but for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to pick the adrenal cortex. Okay, so let's go ahead and fill in our missing information here. So if we want to stimulate the adrenal cortex, we of course want the hypothalamus to secrete CRH, which will cause the anterior pituitary to secrete ACTH, and then the adrenal cortex will respond to that ACTH by making cortisol, of course. So the negative feedback here is going to be a little bit more sophisticated than what we've seen before. So the way negative feedback has worked in the past is that once a stimulus goes away, the whole homeostatic mechanism should just naturally shut itself off because the sensor no longer has an issue to detect anymore. So the whole thing just kind of naturally shuts itself off. Well, some of these hormones that we're going to be talking about, like cortisol and thyroid hormone and the sex hormones, we want those hormones to constantly kind of be within a normal range. And because these hormones are themselves regulated by other hormones, the negative feedback is just naturally going to be a little bit more complicated. So let's take this chronologically first. Let's say we assume that, even though it's not very realistic, let's assume that there is no cortisol in the blood right now and there's no ACTH. So let's say that the hypothalamus detects a stimulus that indicates that we need some cortisol around. So the hypothalamus detects this stimulus. So it is going to produce CRH, that will get to the anterior pituitary, and that will raise the levels of ACTH, that will get to the adrenal cortex, and finally we are starting to produce cortisol. But how are we going to ensure that we are making enough cortisol? We want to make enough cortisol, but we don't want to make too much. So this is how it works. Once we have decided that we have made enough cortisol, this cortisol that is now in the blood it is actually going to be able to, in addition to having effects on tissues all throughout the body, it is going to feed back all the way. It's going to feed back all the way back to the hypothalamus. And when cortisol binds to receptors in the hypothalamus, that is going to shut down any further production of CRH. So that would then lead to a decrease in ACTH levels, which would then lead to a slowing down of the release of cortisol. And keep in mind, this is if we have made enough cortisol already. In addition, that cortisol can also feed back to the anterior pituitary and get it to stop producing ACTH. The ACTH can do the same sort of thing. So ACTH also has some control over the production of CRH, and we can further shut that down at that level as well. So these processes are called long loop and short loop feedback. So this mechanism is in place to make sure that we do not make more hormone than we really need. Now, of course, this cuts the other way. If we do not have enough cortisol, then we are not going to have this feedback, and that is going to cause the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary to ramp up their production of CRH and ACTH respectively. So this sort of mechanism cuts both ways. If we have too much hormone, then the negative feedback should be working really well so that we don't make any more and we can let those hormonal levels come back down. If we don't have enough hormone, those negative feedback mechanisms are not on, and we can make more of these ACTH and CRH hormones so that we can get cortisol levels back up. So hopefully you found this short little video helpful in trying to understand how these feedback loops work. So I will go ahead and sign off for now, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.